Good morning and welcome to our second presidential election youth dialogue. I'm happy to be joined by 5 esteemed panelists who are joining me from different countries. I'm joined from Zimbabwe, from Namibia, from South Africa, and as well as from Poland. My first panelist is Mr. Delight Tatenda Muchazondida, who is currently a development practitioner and is also currently serving as the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Youth Policy Tracking. Mr. Muchazondida, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much, my brother, Mr. Chikumbu, for creating the platform. And a very good afternoon, evening to our colleagues and to our listeners across the globe. So I would agree with you that this conversation has come at an opportune time where we are presented with questions of issues of democracy, issues of elections, and how possibly Africa can tailor-make it to then respond to its specific problems. And I would want to say the importance of elections is that it helps us answer the complex question of legality and legitimacy, because that is the only available mechanism currently that allows people from different paradigms, political paradigms, to meet, to sit down, and to interrogate basic issues of national development. It also gives the government the opportunity to address the national question. Mind you, when we talk about legitimacy and legality, we are presenting the demands of the people. So the government, through their selling of manifestos, through their interface with their organic structures, which are the ultimate voters, they're able to fully understand the national question. It's one thing to assume what the masses want, but it's also another different ballgame to understand what is really needed. Then thirdly, it helps in the allocation of national resources. Once you understand that there is a bridge between what we ought to ask the national question and what is needed by the citizenry, yeah, better placed to then allocate the very few and scarce national resources. So it's a very important procedure that helps us identify as human beings. We are not in the jungle where we need to resolve our dispute by fights or we raid each other, but rather we have a civilized means of interrogating and understanding this issue. And let me hasten to say that there's no perfect democracy, so there should not be any pressure on Africa to emulate any specific template, but rather for us to have our own organic democratic system that places elections at the center of that, so that the voice of almost everybody is heard. Thank you so much.
That is wonderful. I am also joined by Ruvimbo Muchenje, who is a journalist and reporter at the Newswalks. She joins me from Harare. Ruvimbo, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anotida, for this opportunity to speak on the elections, on the eve of elections, what we would need to do to ensure that we have free and fair elections. I've been doing media for the past 4 years, and from all that I've learned that the media is very, very important and very key in ensuring a free and fair election. Information should be given to people. The media should have access to information so that they can give it to the people ahead of elections. We need people to make an informed decision when they are voting. We are going to give them that by giving them relevant information, accurate information, so that as the electorate, they make their own decisions based on having all the facts on the table. So as we, on the eve of elections, we need to introspect. What is it that we would need as a country to say our election was free and fair? And that is anchored on how the media shows one party, 2 parties, 3 parties over others. But all in all, what we need is access to information as the media, so that people can access all the information they need before they make a decision ahead of elections. Thank you.
That is great, Ruvimbo. Thank you so much. I'm also joined by Dr. Primrose Bimha, who is an international relations and gender studies scholar. She joins me from Cape Town in South Africa, and she also recently graduated with a PhD from the University of Cape Town. Dr. Primrose, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anotida, fellow panelists, as well as the viewers. Thank you for inviting me to this crucial discussion, because I think that ideally in any democracy, there should be no substitute for election-based competition. So we definitely need election cycles. And the exercise of regular elections in which multiple political parties and candidates compete in a free and fair environment is requisite. Unfortunately, despite pronounced commitment to democratic values, most post-colonial dispensations in Africa have remained fragile. And so we see that this is mostly owing to disputes over election outcomes in particular, and discontent with what we are trying to frame as fairness or fairness. So generally, elections have not been a sufficient method of consolidating democracy. And when we look at the case of Zimbabwe in particular, there's a general perception that election outcomes are compromised by incumbency benefits due to liberation credentials, mass media bias, and support from security authorities as well as election management bodies. So since the early 2000s, the hunger for regime change, for example, has been characterized by this hope for change in a process that yields an outcome, of course, that has to be in the favor of these people. So we see that there's a lot of post-election anxiety associated with the fear delay of outcomes, which often leads to unrest after polls. And ahead of election day, a lot of fear and anxiety as well are often fueled with suspicions about inaccurate voters' rolls and polling station records. So with regards to freedom, elections that have been held since the early 2000s in Zimbabwe have been associated with varying degrees of political violence linked to intimidation and disputes over results. So I think that to declare that 2023 will be characterized by a total miracle different from that will be very overly simplistic and optimistic. But I think that it's definitely possible as we go through different election cycles. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. I am also joined by Mr. Emmanuel Muzingwani, who is with the Interactive Diplomatic Desk, and he currently joins me from Namibia. Mr. Emmanuel, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chikumbu, for having me on this platform. I'm also delighted to see familiar faces as fellow panelists. So this is a very important discussion that you have set up for us to discuss as young people, and most importantly, to just cross-pollinate ideas to find ways and means that will usher in maybe the future that you want, the democracy that you want. As you note that elections by themselves, they are formed under a social contract. Myself coming from a diplomatic background, I do believe that these are sort of negotiations where citizens, the electorate, they negotiate with different players or those that seek to represent them in different areas. You find that constitutions, they start with the abstract to say, we the peoples. Even the United Nations Charter, it speaks about we the peoples. So this reflects the fundamental aspect to do with the principle of democracy. That democracy rests with individuals, it rests with people. We have had a shift where mostly sovereignty used to rest within a state, but now it also sits and resides with people. Of course, we have questions around it, but what we see elections doing is that aspect to give an opportunity for individuals to actually practice what has been fought before previously. If you go into your history, you find that people fought for the liberation struggle mostly was based on all those ideas and principles for representation. So we believe that even those that are within different areas and different places, they should have that opportunity to actually ensure that they cast their vote. I'm delighted also that this platform is coming in today where we are seeing elections that are currently occurring in Nigeria. So we are seeing young people coming forth. Of course, we have all these issues that seem to backlog issues around democracy. This speaks to the issues around the process itself. Election is not a one-day event, it's a process. So the process starts with even those looking at the limitation reports. We are looking at the participation, the right to freedom to assemble. But you find that in various countries, even Zimbabwe, you've got restrictive laws that are kind of barring people from actually assembling. So for us to judge elections as them being free and them being important, it speaks to the volume of the process that are being involved now until the election day, as well as the announcement of the results. So it's a whole process, and I thank you very much for actually convening this platform for us to share these ideas. Thank you, and over to you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm also joined by Blessing Mudavanhu, who is currently with Culvin University in Poland. Mr. Blessing, thank you for making the time.
We've been having elections since 1980, and a lot has been happening throughout those elections. There's been happening things like political violence and alleged malpractice. As young people, we used platforms like this to discuss further successes, to see that our elections are going the right way, and our elections ensure that democracy is checked, democracy is preserved per se. Thank you, Trida, for having this discussion. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. So now I'm sure that you know that the audience and the followers of this platform do always send us questions that they would like the panelists to answer. So we received some questions that were directed to the panelists that are participating in this discussion. So the very first question that I have is directed to Mr. Delight Tatenda Muchazondida, and it reads that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission preliminary report, which was tabled before Parliament early this year, received unanimous criticism from political parties who argue that it was conducted under unclear circumstances. Parliament's ad hoc committee tasked to analyze the preliminary report also leveled criticism in its findings. But many youths out there do not really understand what this is all about. And what is a delimitation process, and why is it important for an election? What was particularly wrong with the delimitation report by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission? Mr. Muchazondida.
No, this is a mouthful, but we will try and speak it in terms that even our beloved listeners and those who are watching us can be sufficiently answered. And it's important to understand, even ZEC, whenever they discharge their duty, they always qualify elections as something that is logical. That is something that is legal, not logical. So it's going to be very difficult now to highly compress the procedural work that is to go into delimitation and also sufficiently answer on the questions to follow. But I think simply put, delimitation is an exercise of us breaking down our country into smaller constituents and wards that affords people to be able to vote. So that's basically the process, and it's punctuated by the drawing of boundaries based on what is characterized as community of interest and also other issues. So for in-detailed reading, I would encourage our listeners and our viewers to go through the Zimbabwean Constitution from section 161 to 160 to section 161.12. So the delimitation exercise is a process is an exercise that is carried out after every 10 years. This is done in tandem with the national census. So it's going to also to address on what is particularly wrong or what was flawed with this report that caused the upheaval with the citizenry. So section 160, paragraph 1 speaks about it's a periodic event that is to be done after every 10 years. Why is that so? Because we need to have the data that is going to allow us to understand. But here's the difference now, and a lot of people, they get confused when we talk about using the census report. When the boundaries are being delimited, they are based on numbers of registered voters, not numbers of citizens. So you find yourself people arguing that in Harare South we have 3 constituents. It's because there was massive voter mobilization and voter education to an extent that almost everybody in Harare South was able to register to vote. And as a result, we were going to speak about the principle of derogation on the variance, the needed variance of 20%. So what do we do in such a scenario? You're forced to make sure that you delimit appropriate constituencies that are able to look at that variance. Section 2 speaks about the guidelines. So the guidelines in this context, and one of the things that a lot of people were concerned about was the time of the release of the report for it to go to the president and making sure that it fits within the 6 months. So the section 161, paragraph 2 speaks about the final report should be produced and also go through the various channels of the National Assembly in both houses. It also goes to the president, the preliminary report, they read it through, and they also give their comments, and the final report should be tabled before the 6 months. So that's why you find that there was a sense of urgency across the political players and from ZEC itself to make sure that this process has been conducted, it has been done. And given that it's a constitutional process, it was very prudent that every stakeholder was involved. And on that, Mr. Chikumbu, I would want to qualify that I think ZEC did a splendid job because they did a series of stakeholder engagement, which I also want to then extend and split the case to say most of the times the citizens, they rely on political parties to inform them. And because they've got political interest, their political communication tends to favor what they want to push. And sometimes they capitalize on ignorance. So, and I'm going very fast here. I will not go through all the sections, but section 3 speaks about the general principle of equity, whose voice shall be heard. That's why I was speaking about the very strong importance of stakeholder representation. A lot of people, they think the limitation process only focuses on those that are actively political participation. But even the business community, they also need to participate in that. I'll give an example that was given by ZEC itself. Mr. Chikumbu are opening up a factory, and you're being told that in Ward 5, your water rates are A, B, C, D, and they vary from that in Ward 6. And the delimitation process did not manage to capture the community of interest on why it was important maybe to have a specific industry in one space. That's why you find even our special economic zones, you find them in a specific ward or in a specific constituency. It's such issues. Then the derogation, which is something that up to date has caused citizens to question the seriousness and the parity when it comes to ZEC, because a lot of stakeholders, they are talking about 40% variance in other constituencies. We find it in Gweru, specifically in Gweru. I'm sure it's Ward 7. If I'm mistaken, please forgive me, because again, we have not seen the final report, but the preliminary report that has gone through to the president. We also spoke about section 61(5). Straddling of boundaries. So when you are delimiting boundaries, you should not leave a vacuum. I'm talking about an issue where you leave a no man's land, a space that is unaccounted for, to say, because the specific community in A, they wanted their boundary to end here, and because this land is not occupied, or any other reason that are justified by the presenter, we are going now to have a vacuum in terms of boundaries. That's why you find that specifically in Hwange, we have a constituency that covers 60 kilometers. It is generally because the area is mainly for wild animals. And because there's no straddling of boundaries, it has to be accounted for in that context. So we talk about general principles, existing local boundaries, population area, physical features in the area. Our tradition as well. Do these traditional leaders also agree on how we are going to divide that? Imagine if you're going to wake up one day as a traditional leader, and you're being told that you lost specific constituencies, and it has not been fully explained to you in terms of why is that so, because mind you, it's also for electoral and administrative. Now, I want to address the second part of your question. The submission of preliminary report has to go to the parliament and to the president, and it has to be done within 7 working days. So I'm happy that you chose the ad hoc committee report. Why is that important to this conversation? You will find civil society, they lobby through parliament. So the likes of other institutions, I'm sure they had their own caucus representing their issue. You also find both house of the parliament, all these political parties. So I think it's a document that is easily agreeable by almost everyone. And so the second part of the question is speaking about why is it important in an election? And I'm sure if we're going, let me pay respect to the earlier submissions that were given by other presenters. We spoke about legitimacy. Legitimacy comes from the data. How many people voted for you? We have got the Chegutu West scenario. If we do not delimit boundaries and there's no derogation, how are we going to hold each other accountable then to say this was not done fairly, this was not done properly? So that's the number one issue that we need to understand. Then number two, it is for our national institutional history as a country. We need to understand our population. We need to understand who is where and what they are doing. And if there's any justified efforts for us to intensify the call for people to register to vote, or the call for people to participate in elections, you find that kind of information from the delimitation exercise. And I'll give you an example. We have got a population that is close to 14 million, but the total population that is managed to register to vote is 5 million. So after the election, we're going to need to have a proper scientific national development conversation to say what's wrong, because we had almost a virgin voters of 1 million, but they did not register to vote. So where's the gap? Where's the problem? What needs to be done? And this is within a very idealistic community where post-elections, everybody is focused on national development. The other thing why delimitation is important, I'm sure I also have my brother from the diplomatic space. They also want to understand the stakeholders of democracy because we are signatories to certain specific protocols. I'm sure Dr. Primrose can attend to that. You are a doctor. I'm sure you're pregnant with information on that subject. But the international community now needs to understand how is this process being carried out and where do we have as a reference point of agreeable information. And this is the delimitation access program that is done in tandem with the census report. So now what is specifically or what is flawed in the process? Number one, our constitution detects that the delimitation exercise has to be informed by the final census report. And up to date, Zimbabwe does not have a final census report. What we have is a preliminary report that is also being debated by other stakeholders that are interested in terms of figures. So it informs us that the final product, which is borrows its inspiration, is compromised, and it only suggests that the report itself will be compromised. That's one of the biggest problems that we find with this current delimitation exercise. Secondly, I think Parliament produced a 11-point dossier that spoke to what was specifically wrong with the delimitation exercise. And one of them was the incorporation of information and technology. So they use a GIS software, which is you punch in the numbers and it had to redraw some of the boundaries without proper justification. That's why you find the Parliament signal to say, what is the justification for this redrawing? This was GIS generated, and at the end of the day, it gave a problem. It also, the aspect, and I think it's critical to this election, the derogation to say, when we win by margins, understand that in 2018, a certain presidential candidate said, I was not worried about the MPs, but I was worried about the presidential one. They spoke to derogation because they were calculating their margins. So imagine, Dr. Chikumbu, you win in this Zoom meeting by 12, then you also lose in the next Zoom meeting by 32,000. The addition, the summation at the end of the election, you will lose because the level of error or the level of separation in terms of constituents is too high. And to this date, ZEC is not yet able to fully justify on some of the derogation and why the discrepancy is too much. We hope it has been addressed in the report that was given to the president, and we can only have a proper position once it has been discussed. The Parliament also spoke about unspecified scale of the map. So this may sound so mundane to our educated participants in this Zoom call, but without a scale, how do we know this boundary was redrawn, and how do we come to the justification why it was drawn by that? And the scale is informed by statistics, by data, by figures, and with the lack of the figures, it simply then suggests that even the delimitation report that was produced was not informed by statistics. Mind you, I talked about the final. We spoke about the final census report informing the delimitation exercise. We have got unlabeled words. So in essence, this is more like a fancy vacuum constituents without a name. Because if you don't label a word, who is it designated for? So it brings now the issues of legitimacy and fairness of the election into context. Why did you unlabel this specific boundary? It speaks about the issues of polling stations not being indicated on the maps. And this also was an issue. You find that a lot of citizens are saying, I come from Highfield East constituents, but today I'm being told that I need to vote in Highfield South constituents. And maybe sometimes you need to commute there. This is informed by the redrawing of boundaries. But now, if the polling stations are not indicated to say in this specific word, this is what you're going to find, at the end of the day, it becomes problematic. I'm sure you can all attest that it feeds to the apathy that you need to maybe to commit to 13 kilometers, 15 to 20 kilometers in urban centers for you to access the next polling station. At the possible misinterpretation of the minimum and the maximum threshold, we spoke about that, the lack of justification changes of boundaries in specific wards and constituents. I'm sure some of the concerned quarters, they spoke about how the Matabeleland region lost about 3 constituencies and how they were now found in Harare South. So these are some of the issues that was not fully and sufficiently covered by our delimitation report. It also speaks about a high complicated coordinated system that was the GIS. To this day, we've got very people who can interpret the information, or you can even maintain it. And we understand that sometimes as human beings are victims of technology. Maybe you put figures that you don't understand and you cannot reverse the error. So there were issues of the legal compliance and issue, the governing. I'm sure Section 160 and 161 of the Constitution, 37A, the Electoral Act, provides for the legal basis for the delimitation electoral boundaries. So again, I refer our listeners and I refer our viewers to then borrow wisdom from our Constitution, because now this is a very big and a very complicated parallel discussion we're going to have in terms of fully unpacking some of these constitutional provisions and paragraphs. So, Dr. Chikumbu, I hope I have managed to sufficiently answer the three-party question in terms of what goes on with the delimitation process. And we mentioned to that, why is it important? And at the end of the day, why was this problematic? And we have alluded to this. And I think, to my worry, the biggest challenge is, even in Parliament, this has not been treated as a national development issue. It has been treated as a partisan issue. So you find there are specific questions to why those that are affiliated to the ruling party and the ruling party itself did not raise eyebrows and question this exercise, and is supposed to give parity to active aspirants. We also have people that are coming from the CCC suggesting that, no, this is a desktop exercise. It can simply be readdressed when someone is seated on their computer. We have got some that are coming from the MDCA saying, no, let us throw it away totally because it does not address to the constitutionality of it. And because of that, there will not be any rational disputation because, again, we have forfeited constitutional principles. And we've also got Pollard that is also threatening to take ZEC to Parliament. But whether that will happen or not now is an issue of neither here or there, because we know Justice Chibumba tabled the report and the Gazette suggested it was tabled on the 17th of February. So this is a process that is ongoing and is very difficult now to interface with it at this level. Thank you.
That's true. Thank you so much for those submissions. We'll obviously reflect on that and to invite others to reflect on it as well. I now want to bring in Ruvimbo Muchenje. I'm happy that we bring somebody with some experience in mass communication and journalism who's also been covering this issue of delimitation. So, Ruvimbo, what have been your experiences reporting about parliamentary processes around delimitation processes? And can we trust ZEC that it can hold a free and fair election against this backdrop? I'm sure you heard some of the concerns that was raised by Mr. Muchazondida. And the last question is that, are the anomalies flagged in the delimitation report grave enough to discredit the credibility of ZEC?
Thank you very much, Arno. This was quite an insightful presentation by the previous speaker. But first things first, my experience covering Parliament and parliamentary processes is that it's probably in the interest of the 210 MPs, the Speaker, and the Parliament staff, as well as the journalists who are covering that particular process. Ordinary people are not really interested. They are the stakeholders. They're the most important element in all this. Delimitation was not only affecting particular MPs, career politicians, as they are called in some quarters. It was affecting everyone. Us being moved from one constituency to the next affected us administratively. But most people didn't really care about how the delimitation process was going on and how the delimitation process was going to affect them. Moving on to how the delimitation process was handled in Parliament, I felt like I would drag to, beg to differ with the previous speaker that this issue was not really dealt with as a national development issue, but along partisan lines. I feel like we had Parliament coming back from holiday when they were supposed to come back the following week. They came back to discuss the delimitation report, to see what could be done better, where to have the analysis done after the ad hoc committee was appointed to deal with the report that had been gazetted, that had been tabled before Parliament. We had our MPs coming into Parliament to discuss and deliberate on the report. But number one issue was the representation of the ad hoc committee. We had more than a PF people, followed by MDC, only one CCC member, and only 2 female parliamentarians. So a lot of issues would then not be included as we would want them included. We would not have the women's perspective, because sometimes it's those things that the previous speaker was alluding to. You could have your issues, you could have your house in one ward, and then if you're moved to another ward, things, your rates, your everything could not be the same because you're now under a different jurisdiction. But that process, that committee that came up with their own analysis of how things could have been done better by ZEC, it had those limitations. Why would we have only one voice from CCC? Why would we have so many voices from ZANU-PF? Would it, if we wanted a smaller team, could we not have one person from each party, because all of them are represented in parliament? Why would we have more from one party and less from the other? Maybe there are issues that give guidelines on how these committees should be constituted. We also have another issue of how these MPs were not really conscientizing the people on the delimitation report. So MPs would come into parliament, talk about how they would not want their constituencies cut or collapsed into others, because obviously they would be left with no constituents. I'll give you an example of Warren Park. Warren Park as a constituency, as Belvedere, as Warren Park as Cold Comfort. Belvedere had been moved to Harare Central. Warren Park had been moved to Kambuzuma. That means there was no Warren Park constituency to speak of. So when the MP stands up to speak, he's not speaking of the administrative issues. He's speaking about how it is unfair to have a whole constituency of about 23,000 people collapsed into another constituency. You see, but those were the issues that really were central in the delimitation process in parliament. And then we move to the issues of how these things were dealt with. I feel most MPs, from their submissions in parliament, their worry was only on whether or not they will be in parliament next year, whether or not they will have a constituency to be in, whether you lose or not, but they had to have been strategically positioned. And that was usually the worries that they were raising. We could have that from, you see, for example, from Epworth, from Kutu South, from every other MP who stood up to speak about this delimitation report was speaking of how these things could have been done better so that their constituencies remained the same. Secondly, there were issues around how MDC would say, please, let's get this out of the way. We are not forced to rush to an election because we had 2 years of COVID and we could not do much in terms of delimitation and a lot of other things. So let's just get this out of the way. Let's not go into elections. Let's do these things properly. But we have constitutional guidelines. We need to get into an election. The boundaries that are there now are the boundaries that we used in the delimitation of 2007-8. A lot has happened between 2007 and 8. A lot of things have happened in between 2007 and 8 and 2023. We cannot have the same boundaries. Our population has also grown, so we cannot have the same boundaries as we get into this particular election. Mm-hmm. Can we trust SEC to hold a free and fair election against this backdrop? Mm-hmm. We cannot. Mm-hmm. We certainly cannot trust SEC to hold a free and fair election against this backdrop. Apart from the delimitation report, there are a lot of issues that are being leveled against SEC. We have the issues around the voters roll, how they're not really keen on giving people the voters roll. The MPs also raised that issue that we need the voters roll to also assist in creating and remapping our wards, our constituencies. But then we did not have that. So we cannot really trust them to hold a free and fair election.
Dr. Prim. So now, Dr. Prim, I'm sure that you listened to the submissions of Ruvimbo and Mr. Muchazondida. They are quite sophisticated things that they bring out, and such kind of information is not exposed to voters of all different types. Those living in rural areas, those living in urban areas. So there is a submission that was made here by one of our audience, and it says that voters may lack information about electoral processes, qualifications, and policy positions of candidates, and how to protect their vote from fraud, making it difficult to make an informed vote choice or to generally develop interest in registering to vote. In light of the above, should there be any qualifications for voting? Who ought to have the right to vote, and should every citizen have an equal vote?
Thank you very much for the question. And I think it comes at a time when there's been several sophisticated submissions. And I think I will start with the part where we ask who should vote. I personally believe that generally, if you're a citizen above the age of 18, and regardless of where you are located within the world, there should be provisions for such Zimbabweans to be able to vote. That they make informed choices will obviously depend on the information that is available. So obviously, ZEC is at the helm of things. They should be giving relevant information to political parties, to their candidates, as well as to the mass media. So I think currently the qualifications for voting are quite reasonable, except of course, we do know that Zimbabweans living in the diaspora do not have that right. And there's been a lot of hesitancy to allow for such to happen. And each citizen should definitely have an equal vote to the next person. Now, when we speak about informed choice, I assume that we've already spoken about people who are registering to vote. So these are the people that we're focusing on. I think that whoever has registered should be able to vote in a manner which suits their interests. In Zimbabwe, I think politicians tend to win based on individual popularity or the popularities of their political banners. So ideology, in terms of what they promise to us, whether economic or political reforms, matters to a limited extent in most cases. And I think that policy positions of candidates do matter, but when it comes to how people have been voting over the years, they don't matter a lot because we've seen that there's been very few socioeconomic reforms. So our poll exercises have not translated into what we would desire to have in our cities or in our areas in terms of changes made by councillors, by members of parliament, by ministers, and so forth. So I do think that most voters in Zimbabwe are aware of legal channels that can be pursued when it comes to grievances, because usually these are issues that relate to candidates as well as political parties themselves putting forward court cases. So as demonstrated by past cases, particularly linked to the presidential elections, I think that people are aware that those who need to put up the challenges will do so, and they put up the requisite support when the politicians they are supporting are in the courts. So what we need to think about also, I think, is to think about having more local election observers, because when we speak about a climate where we often encounter disputes over poll outcomes, there's always questions as to what was at the polls, how many people observed, and in some constituencies, this has been lacking. So in terms of promoting more voters, we should also promote more local observation so that we can try by all means to increase our confidence in these electoral processes, as well as to undermine the chances of any forms of electoral fraud. So I think that referring back to what previous speakers have spoken about, it's important that government should make it easy for all of us to register and participate in good time, and that includes diaspora vote. Election dates must be published well ahead of time, and elements of doubt, for example, the census and the delimitation reports that have been discussed, should be finalized, I think even at latest a year before the polling date. And then furthermore, the voters' roll is always an issue, I think, ahead of almost every election we've experienced. So these should be clean, accurate, and available to citizens, to parties, to candidates, and well maintained so that it increases confidence both in ZEC and in the electoral processes. So I think we should also think about how, when it comes to decision making and looking at elections that have been happening across the region, some people have said we will have a Zambia situation one day if many people vote. We will have a Malawi situation one day if our judges exercise impartiality and whatnot. I think those are some elements that are still a bit shaky within the Zimbabwean context. So we see that, for example, some people that I've interviewed in my research have spoken about choosing to stay away from electoral processes, choosing not to even register because they experienced fatigue. They tried before and they felt that nothing changed, things got worse. Because if it's about us choosing people to represent us and to make life better for us, this has not happened before, so how can it happen now?
And then I've also spoken to people who've resigned to focusing on their survival tactics, whether it's moving to another country, whether you're hustling within the Zimbabwean context, and then let those who vote, and the government that is put into the order goes in, and we just continue being survivalists. So I think that the question about who should vote, I think everyone should aim to vote if you're above 18 and you're a citizen, and exercise your choice. Our context, like I said, is mostly about the popular individual candidates or political parties. So that obviously will sway how you vote more often than you are looking into what is their mandate. For example, we have right now changes happened in the opposition camp, and there's no clear manifesto or what to expect. But then if what you wish for is something that is other than what you've been experiencing, you might have to go that route because it's an alternative, not that it's presenting certain solid ideas that you want to review and subscribe to. So I think those are my submissions in response to that question. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I would now want to bring in Mr. Emmanuel Muzingwani. Based on the submissions, obviously, that have been raised by Dr. Bimha and even the previous other speakers, I'm sure you were following as well the submissions on the limitation report. It's an issue that is of critical concern, not just to voters, but to the candidates that are also participating in the elections. And what role can the international standards and practices that are prescribed by organizations like the United Nations, the African Union, SADC, and ECOWAS play to facilitate a free and fair election? And is election observer mission management itself, is it even necessary in the very first instance?
Thank you very much for putting across those questions. And I also thank the speakers for their submissions. What I've also wanted to tend is an issue around, if we check carefully, the reason why maybe some countries like Zimbabwe, they do not want a diaspora vote or for people from diaspora to actually vote. I just want to just respond to just addition to what Dr. Bimha was indicating there. It's the issue to see that most of them, they've been forced to go outside the country because of the political and economic turmoil that is currently being faced in Zimbabwe. So most of them, they are prescribed or they're thought of as siding with the opposition. They mostly coming in, them voting, it will mean another issue. So it's very difficult and it's very challenging to actually have this kind of diaspora vote. But relating now to your question, where you've indicated what are some of the best practices that we can see or what is needed within the framework of elections, even election observation itself. You'd figure out that for Zimbabwe is not an island, just like many other countries. So there are rules and standards that are acceptable universally. So these principles of democracy, as has been alluded by the previous speaker, to say that maybe sometimes you don't need to be prescribed what we constitute democracy within Zimbabwe. But what is universally acceptable, Zimbabwe itself is part and parcel of different organizations, the African Union, United Nations, etc. So within those framework, within those aspects, is in understanding that when you have different organizations coming in, theirs is a duty to ensure that there's openness and transparency. Like I've alluded earlier on to say that election is not an event, it's a process. So all these processes are being monitored currently from a distance. At the same time, we see challenges in actually deploying election observers from outside at this particular time when we don't know the date when elections are going to occur. And the only time that all these shenanigans that are happening around the limitation reports, some observers are not in the country to observe what's happening or to understand, conduct stakeholder consultations. The only time that they will come is maybe 2 months, a month before the election time. So this also poses a challenge. But what we'd want to note is that the first election observation mission was conducted in South Korea around 1948 by the United Nations. So this in itself entailed that there was need then to ensure that there's issues around enhancing public confidence in the government, because most people, they may not trust their government, but they feel they find comfort or refuge if another third party, an international party, comes within the country and also undertake maybe these observations. You will find out that with the election observation, it also eases tensions and sometimes issues around insecurity. You find that as a country, you need to maintain peace within the world. So if there are no observers, this can lead to such issues around election conflict. So these election conflicts, they may eat or may have spillover effects on surrounding countries and the world itself at large. So we need these election observers to actually conduct due diligence, look into the nitty-gritties around how these elections are currently being observed. Of course, as I've noted, there are challenges. You may not deploy or AU missions, you may not deploy SADC missions, you may not deploy UN observer missions to all polling stations in the country. There are some that may be targeted, and this also poses a challenge to ensure that these observer missions, they don't have enough resources to cover all polling stations. It has been the case that you have all these observer missions covering maybe all the polling stations. This could also ensure that you see the transparency, you defend the votes and see what is currently happening at a given poll. Because some of these polling stations are located far deep in the rural areas and people may not have access to those polling stations. You also find out that to just maybe look into the enhancement of the credibility of those in authority. So you need this observer mission to ensure that issues of credibility of whoever is going to be voted into power, they are of paramount importance. You would note that for far too long, Zimbabwe is not maybe invited observer missions from EU, from USA, was only occurred in the last election to sort of bring in some sort of sanity or to just portray that there is a shift in democracy. But you would find out that it is not the case. What some schools of thought would argue to say that you find that if you don't have other maybe third-party international actors like the United Nations, EU, the USA, etc., you find that if you only find the African Union or SADC, these are mostly meant to rubber stamp whatever elections that are ongoing. So there is also need to ensure that we look at who is being invited to be an observer. We look at who is coming into the country to observe this election. So I speak to say that election observation is very key and it's very important to diffuse these issues around rubber stamping. At the same time, there are challenges with it. You note that issues around sovereignty, there are challenges with states. Even in Zimbabwe, where you have got this whole memory around colonization, where you think that if you are inviting all these election observation missions, it's in a way disrupting or distracting the sovereignty of a state, of a country. There are also arguments around intervention within a state, where you find that maybe some observer missions are there to aid a certain part or a certain side in their reporting, which in case might not also be, which in each case it may not necessarily be true, because you've seen what has happened in other African countries, where you find other observer missions, they side with a certain political party, or they want a political outcome that will favor them or that will favor what they may need or their interest within that country. So those are the challenges that come also with the observer missions. You also look into say that election observation, they are very important in terms of refusing or diffusing challenges around democratic change of governance. So you find if you have an observer mission, if you find election observers that come within the country, they are there on the basis to ensure that there's unconstitutional change of government. We can applaud the African Union in some instances where it has been able to actually ensure that they suspend some of the member states. You find in 2012, Guinea-Bissau was suspended because of unconstitutional change of government. Even Madagascar was also suspended from the African Union because of this unconstitutional change of government that had occurred in the country. We still have questions that linger around us. What happened with the way we saw that Mugabe stepped down a long time ago. So questions are still surrounding what kind of transition took place. Was this also not an unconstitutional change of government that occurred, but we didn't hear or we didn't see a strong voice from the African Union? They just sort of rubber-stamped to say that because of the way it was being portrayed to the world. At the same time, we didn't have enough observer missions at that particular time because there was no election. But I was saying that it's important that when you're having elections, 2 years, 3, 4 years before that election, if funds permit, you may have these observer missions to actually observe what's happening within that particular country. Today, you see it that if you check around, they've been banning of maybe gatherings, just election campaigns, especially for Triple C members or Triple C as a political party. They are not being given or accorded that opportunity to actually assemble because of these acts that are existing within the country. So in the absence of observer missions to actually see these kind of issues, it will be very then difficult to see what kind of an election we are going to have as a country. So these are all challenges that when we look at, we come to a conclusion that election observation, indeed, it is very important and it's very critical to the whole fabric of the establishment of elections, because it gives an opportunity or it gives a room to build on what occurred maybe in a country A. You find that there were challenges with elections. Then you can recommend what an election the outcome of election or how that election should be conducted. You have those recommendations that you put across or that you put forward for a particular country. So yeah, even as I conclude, you'd see that all these delimitation reports that you're having in Zimbabwe, the issues around it, you find that the AU, the UN, they have got sort of guidelines that they indicate. They don't go into the specificity of how they should, the delimitation report should look like. But what is mostly observed is that it has to be reflective of the will of the people. And citizens should be able to participate, should have a voice. But what we've seen currently, even the submission from our fellow journalists here and even Delight, you see that the participation has not been that recognized, or there's not been that voice from citizens. There's not that voter education. Platforms like radios, TVs, newspapers, and even the MPs, they have a duty to go into different constituencies to preach, to inform people about this delimitation report. It also even goes a step further to look at the involvement of other different players, like the non-government organizations. Today, you've got a closure of, I think, 130 organizations that have been banned in the country. I think there are more than that, NGOs. And these have been playing a critical role even in democracy building, in the capacity building spaces, to go into those different constituencies to preach about this delimitation report or to inform people around what is currently happening in the country. So when you have, those are our first sort of permanent observer missions that we have. NGOs, sometimes they just observe what's happening within a country. And they would also want to report to bring around development, bring about aid. So in the absence of them being banned within the country, it's really a challenge. It's a challenge for them to us to actually ensure that citizens are informed about the initial report. And I'd say that I'll conclude, but allow me then to conclude now, to see the issue with establishment of permanent diplomatic missions, embassies. There have been charges of interference. I looked at my master's studies at the charges around interference of the USA in Zimbabwe, that they seek to actually take over the sovereignty of the country, or they want to institute their own government within Zimbabwe. So embassies, they play a critical role also to monitor and report. These are within the convention, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. They have been prescribed that they should monitor and observe and report back to their sending states the occurrences within different space or different countries in terms of human rights, in terms of development issues, in terms of diseases that are actually occurring within that country. So when you have a country that maybe denounces the participation of embassies or the participation of diplomats within their political and economic sphere, their fears around, okay, change of government, yes, one, that may occur and it is occurred in other countries. But the mere participation of these diplomats and ambassadors to observe, or a diplomatic mission to observe what's happening in the country, is in an actual fact to actually build a healthy democracy. But the challenge comes in to say, why only Western diplomats are involved in maybe observing and reporting? We don't see it with other African diplomats within the country. There comes another question of just rubber stamping that occurs within African countries. They just want to side with each other. Because at their back, whatever, at their sending state, they also still have what are termed despots that are ruling within their country. So they want to just cover up for each other. So in a nutshell, these are my observations, and I believe that election observation is very key and important. While it may eat into the monies and resources, but it is very critical and important to build a healthy democracy. Thank you, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel. Now, let me bring in Blessing Mudavanhu. Just briefly, could you tell us what's your opinion based on the submissions that have been made by other panelists and your careful study of the developments that have been happening in Zimbabwe? Do you feel that Zimbabwe is ready to have a free, fair, and credible election?
Okay, thank you, Sida, for this opportunity. Once again, I would like to thank the panelists for bringing in interesting and careful submissions. I really enjoyed listening to their submissions. Well, it would be unfair to say that Zimbabwe is currently ready for a free and fair election, judging on the basis that democracy itself is shrinking to a large extent. The date of the election is not yet there. The people themselves are not even well informed that there is an election this year. The delineation report was not covered well in the media, both in private and public media. People in rural areas, they didn't even know about the delineation report. The opposition party, CC, for instance, it's not allowed to conduct its campaigns. It's being crippled daily by the government. So judging on issues like that, we can say Zimbabwe is not yet ready to conduct a free and fair election. And also looking at ZEC itself, assessing ZEC's capacity as an independent body to host a free and credible election. We can say that ZEC is not credible, judging on its past experiences with the electorate, with the people, judging from the year 2018, whereby the election had to go to the Constitutional Court, the results had to go for validation to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court had to declare a winner. There were a number of significant malpractices and loopholes that were exposed about ZEC that needs to be addressed. We need an Electoral Reform Act first. We need to reform our electoral board, then we can start talking about having free and fair credible election. As a historian, I have studied the history of elections starting from 2002 up to 2018. We see that there have never been an election that has been free and fair conducted in Zimbabwe. Every election is loopholes. One, it is also marred by political violence and other issues of illegitimacy conducting elections. So in short, I can briefly say that Zimbabwe is not ready so far. Over to you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much for those submissions. And thank you so much for raising all these wonderful concerns that you have raised from the first speaker to the very last speaker. I do have some follow-up questions, But I would also want us to quickly conclude in the interest of time to get you to give your closing remarks. But as you give your closing remarks, you can as well respond to the follow-up questions that I have. So I will start with Dr. Primrose Bimha. I'm sure you have heard the submissions that were made by Mr. Emmanuel about the role played by international bodies, regional bodies in the election process. The most difficult question and the most critical thing that most of our audiences, young people want to know is that are these election observer missions, do they come to observe the conduct of the elections, just the voting? Why can't they come to observe the pre-election environment and understand what's actually going on in terms of the delimitation report that was talked about by Mr. Muchazondida? Why can't they also observe the post-election environment to actually understand and figure out whether there is no violence, whether people are content with the result and stuff like that? What are the key areas that need to be adjusted? I'm sure you recently wrote a paper about the African Union. It should be a book chapter or a paper, but I would like to get your opinion on that area. What do you think?
Thank you once again for the opportunity. Thanks to fellow panelists, the viewers and listeners, since this is also sort of like a parting note.
Yes.
And with reference to your question, I think that election observer missions, in particular, the Southern African Development Community one and the African Union one, it's more about supporting each other as African countries. And I think the common word that came up from the previous speaker, Emmanuel, I think was rubber stamp. And I think we also call it, as political analysts, the use of templates. If you look at most election observer mission reports, let's say between 2018 and 2019, you realize much of what was said in the Zimbabwe July election was more or less similar to what was said in the December 2018 for the DRC, for example. And I think that in as much as they try to come just before the election and leave just after the election, they have obviously looking at media airtime. They also look at reports on violence from civilians and whatnot. I think there's not much interest that is vested in, for example, the current processes that are occurring. In international relations, states often do to others what they wish to be done on themselves. So I think in protecting their own interests, they, for example, decided as SADC not to be in Zimbabwe at this crucial time, despite Zimbabwe's electoral record, right? We have a precedent, 2018, 2008, and going backwards. So we've seen that sometimes within SADC, there are some reports that report a bit differently. For example, the SADC Parliamentary Forum, but because they don't have the endorsements, for example, of heads of state, it's usually just pushed away and sidelined along with, for example, reports from the international community. So I think the main problem with SADC is that they want to avoid investing themselves because they will then have to be party to, for example, what happens post the election outcomes. So if there's an election dispute, for example, we're going to say, oh, SADC was here since 2022, let's hear what they have to say. But SADC prefers internal resolution of election crisis, which is why we saw, for example, for Malawi's rerun to happen, it had to be internal. For DRC to resolve its own election disputes over the past 2 election cycles, it had to be mostly internal. So I think that is the main answer as to why SADC doesn't seem to be participating, particularly during such a crucial phase. Another reason is, of course, that there's a lot of Southern African countries going through one political issue or another, and to avoid meddling into each other's messes, they just seem to be aloof. When they are told the election date, they will definitely field election observers. A topic for another day is the reality that more often than not, election observers that come through, for example, the SADC and the AU, come from institutions that are just there to perform this task of to tick boxes and report minimally, and not necessarily, for example, NGO-driven observers. So the composition of AU and SADC observer missions is already something that needs to be questioned. I hope that gives some form of response to what you were seeking from my end.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Let me get Mr. Delight Tatenda Muchazondida. You gave some very interesting submissions about the delimitation report, but in your final submissions, you indicated the flaws that are part of this report that was presented by ZEC to Parliament and to the general public. Now, because of the graveness of this fault, do they warrant us to say we cannot have an election in June?
Thank you so much. I think when I started, I qualified that the entrusted institutions, they look at elections as a legal process, not as a logical one. So the biggest challenge that we have at hand now is we are dealing with an issue of substantive governance and procedural governance. So procedurally, Zimbabwe have done all its homework because we are talking about the delimitation process being, the census process being done, the delimitation process being done, being taken to both houses of the parliament. They gave their feedback, it was addressed in 7 days and going to the president. So at the end of the day, procedurally, Zimbabwe is ready for elections. Unfortunate as it may sound, but that's what's on the ground. And even the international community also, they also adhere to those kind of structural founding. How do we do our elections? Now, the question of substantive democracy, certainly Zimbabwe is in a peculiar state. The level of polarity makes it very difficult, even for an observer like us academics, to say, are we truly ready for an election? So we have got reports of being persecuted and being beaten by the police. And I'm sure that not to defend or not to sound insensitive, but we understand these are some of the things that punctuate a highly political and electoral season. But to the degree of it, what's happening with now the social media, is very difficult to see if this verified news or not. So substantively, we are in a peculiar position which is very difficult to see if we're ready for elections. Coming, number one, from the government being the monopoly of violence, the citizens being very apathetic in terms when it comes to procedural issues of governance, and even the opposition only waits for the electoral year for them to demand electoral reforms. That's what we see. So the raised issues cannot warrant for us to set aside elections, because even members of parliament, both sides of the house, actually, they do agree. If we go to some of the material, Doctor would call it literature review, that has been done by other media houses, you'd find that the available MPs on that bench, they are saying, let us go with the elections. Only for Honorable Komish, who are saying, no, we need to go back on the drawing board. But I also wanted to reflect on some key issues that were submitted. So it's very difficult now to differentiate the state and the ruling party. And it's a given, even in any democracy, you might want to use the control. So the ruling party will always enjoy the time of campaigning because they always infuse their party ideology, national programming. But constitutionally, candidates are only allowed to campaign freely after the proclamation of the election date. So currently, that date has not been set aside. It's very difficult for alternative political institutions to come on board. But Mr. Chikumbu, I know you being an academia, with issues that need further interrogation and that further discredits the readiness of Zimbabwe to conduct an election. Number one, it is the quality of the citizens in terms of understanding what they need to do. Are we voting for ideas or are we voting for personalities? And in Zimbabwe, we vote for personality. So in as far as your personality says we are ready for elections, it then supersedes even your personal standing in the end and buying on that. So it's very difficult now to say you are not ready, but your incumbent or the one that you favor, they're saying you're ready, and collectively you assume that you're ready. Number two, it is the issues of sponsored political violence and sponsored political alarming. Recently, with the people on social media, there's been a lot of political alarmists to say this has been happening, and sometimes when you try to investigate and get to the root of the issue, that's not what's happening. So again, sponsored political violence is a very big challenge, and hopefully, Emmanuel, Muzingwani, you take this into account as the diplomatic community to say how best can you resolve that. Do we need to now have a security? You call it what? Is it the security army, the standby UN security army that is always standing by to see if that can happen? If they can be an avenue of now sharing intelligence and making sure that the reports that get to the final people that come to verify and to monitor elections, they have that in their fingertips. There's also an issue of intimidation and youth apathy, and I think this program is being done by young people. So you find that with the constitutional amendment Act of 2, we only have 10 seats. It's also a contribution. So it's also an avenue of people saying we're not ready for election because young people can be 67.3, but only allowed to vote for 10 slots. Yes, there may be a further argument to say, but these are guaranteed seats. I'm forgetting the actual terminology that I want to use. These are guaranteed seats, but we also understand that the political field is not balanced in terms of how much resources do you have? Is there a resources cap to say you can't use 20,000 and above in an election so that it becomes a fair playing field with the Zimbabwe? A delight myself on less $300 in their pocket. So it's also an issue. So, okay, to put my head on the block here, procedurally, we are substantively, we are not yet ready for elections. And I would agree with ZCC to say, I think we need a sabbatical, maybe of 5 years. I know it's a questionable issue, but the level of plurality is dangerous. The level of plurality, rather we have a GNU, we sort out our mess, and we then go for an election. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see. So now let me get the closing remarks of Mr. Blessing Mudavanhu. So now you have heard what was said, and you also have submitted that with the absence of electoral reforms, we can never say that Zimbabwe is ready. But another issue that also comes out in newspapers and opinions that are given even by the general public of Zimbabwe is that there is just general apathy by young people and by even older people, that people are just not interested in politics, and it has nothing to do with reforms. So if we say we are not ready, is it the absence of reforms? Is it apathy? Mr. Mudavanhu.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you, Tsida. The absence of reforms have instigated, or it has caused us young people and as well as old people to dislike conducting an election, because there is a talk that we go and vote, only one party is going to win every election. One, and also people are intimidated. Violence, as the previous speaker has alluded, there are allegations of political violence and political intimidation. And also, the other issue is that when it comes to us young people, we are tired of having politicians promising us nothing or giving us empty promises towards the election period. So that way, people get uninterested in going to vote because, you know, as a young person, you want a job, you want money, you want to look after your family. The politician comes, buys you alcohol towards the election period. After buying you alcohol, promising you money, cash, jobs, lying that you are going to create jobs. Once the election is done, the politician disappears. We go another 5 years, he comes back, same routine. The young people get uninterested in that because of lack of truthfulness. We go on to the old people. The old people are talking about here, for instance, you can talk about these people in the civil service. People in the civil service, they are underpaid. They don't even have health insurance. They've an issue of lack of electricity, transport, you know, the social issues that are there in Zimbabwe, right? They go to vote, the same party wins. It goes back to the issue of reforms. I'm not saying that one party cannot win elections or every time, but what I'm saying is we go back to the issue of electoral reforms. How are elections being conducted? How is ZEC conducting its electoral process? How is the voters? ZEC as an institution, I think it needs to be disbanded. After being disbanded, people go and remake an electoral board that decides impartially about the future of us in Zimbabwe. So to get back to the question, I can safely say that it's the issue of lack of electoral reforms in our motherland that is caused both young and old people to lack interest in going to vote, to have a lot of voter apathy. One, two, another issue is the issue of influx of migrations. People have migrated to seek greener pastures also, both young and old people. People are everywhere in the world. The Zimbabweans, we are everywhere. From Europe, Asia, to America, where you are.
I'm sure we can see with the mixture that we have right now.
Yeah, that means we need that diaspora vote. It has to be introduced because people in the diaspora also have the right to be heard. They also have the right to decide who governs them and who does not govern them. So it goes back to the issue of electoral reforms. The previous speaker said that we need a GNU or something of that sort for 5 years until things are sorted. I safely say I agree with him because right now we'll be wasting state money going to pause, going to pause when the electoral board itself is not even showing its seriousness. There was an issue raised by Tim Pacheli on Twitter recently about the voters' roll. It indicated a lot of malpractice on the voters' roll. Nothing has been done up to date to address that. So, in short, I can say electoral reforms. After electoral reforms, then people will be interested in going to vote. As it is, people are actually demotivated by the behavior of the electoral board as well as the social conditions in the country. Thank you, Tida.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Muzingwani. Let me now bring you in with your final submissions. Just based on the discussion that we have just had, what are your thoughts?
Thank you once again, Mr. Chikumbu and fellow panelists. Is Zimbabwe ready for elections? It's a big question that we are faced, but also want to, as we conclude, to understand who is Zimbabwe, what Zimbabwe are we talking about? So we've got different parts to it. We have got us, the citizens, the electorate. You also have got institutions that have been put in place. At the same time, you've got those within the paradigms of power. An important aspect that we want to bring here has been raised by Spivak. She's an Indian scholar, and I think if noted around, can the subaltern speak? Can the ordinary citizen in Zimbabwe speak? And to what extent can that individual be heard? We have got different platforms, even social media today. You raise issues around elections, you raise issues of great importance, economic, political issues. But what you find there, it's not everyone who has got access maybe also to these mobile digits, phones and Twitter spaces, etc. Right? So in as much as can people speak, yes, they can be tweet about people, yeah, that's fair and fine, you spread your word, etc. But what extent can those issues be heard by those even in parliament, by the government itself? So there are limitations to which ordinary people, even if they are not really ready for elections. If you find ourselves as young people fielding ourselves going to Instagram, you have got your comedians, you have got those people that are not really bringing that value towards what is pending its issue of election. You find viewers, 17,000 viewing people who are twerking. You find young people viewing people that are actually talking about other gossip issues. You question yourself as young people, where are we going? I think these issues have been raised on different platforms. So it speaks to us. Are we ready as citizens for these elections? Definitely, if you find ourselves also not attending this platform, you see our viewers, they may be limited, but it also speaks to what is it that we regard as important as young people.
True. That's true. That's very true.
You go again to just emphasize as I part what has been highlighted by the other previous speakers. Gatherings for people to do political campaigns are being banned for the obvious reasons. You don't want to include people, you don't just want yourselves to spread propaganda from your one political party. Other political parties, they cannot participate in that race. So if you're looking at those issues, they are big issues, and we cannot say that we are ready for elections. We have noted issues around voter registration, voters' roll. Nobody has access to those voters' roll at the moment, really. And it has to be tallied to the delimitation report. But you cannot tally those things when you don't have that voters' roll to actually tally the numbers and see what are we talking about, which constituents as people that has been registered, and the frustrations that are coming in terms of registering to vote. I've recently checked the news outlet. 10 people only allowed to register to vote per day. So these are issues that are coming not long time ago, but just a few days. You find only 10 people are registered to vote, and you have a young person or even older people that are coming from as far as the ghettos to come to town, maybe to do the registration. So it is this particular moment where we are rushing or racing to elections, where you should see more polling stations, more places where people can come and register to vote. But deliberately, there are no spaces for people to actually go and actually register to vote. Yes, violence has been spoken about. We look also at issues. Are we ready? We might say maybe there's some lessons that we've learned from Malawi, lessons that we've learned from Zambia. I see now there's a campaign that is running under Vote Defend. I'm not sure of the fuller title of that hashtag. But if you have people that are being fielded at polling stations as polling agents to defend and to look at what's happening, young people, the success story of Zambia, as has been told, it aided to the opposition parties fielding their own people to polling stations to ensure that every vote has been counted and the results has been announced. But yes, we might have had it in Zimbabwe, where you have fielded people to go to those polling stations. At the end of the day, they say, who decides who is the winner? So these are various challenges that you find we are facing as a nation. We don't even know the election date. You wake up one day, you are moved to another constituency, you move from Bari, you find yourself, you are being there in Mount Pleasant, a place that you have never lived or you have no relatives that actually reside there. So it's strange what's happening in our country. So I'll conclude by saying, really, is Zimbabwe ready for elections? We ask and answer, who is Zimbabwe, and is that Zimbabwe ready for election? The answer really is no. And thank you, and over to you. Thank you for providing the platform.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, my fellow participants, for your time. And viewers and listeners, thank you so much for listening to this show. I'm happy to have been joined. My panelists, Mr. Tatenda Muchazondida is a development practitioner and is currently serving as the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Youth Policy Tracking Group. I'm also happy to have been joined by Dr. Primrose Bimha, who is an international relations and gender studies scholar. She's currently joining me from Cape Town. She recently graduated with a PhD from the University of Cape Town, Ruvimbo Muchenje. We had some network connection challenges, but she is a journalist and reporter at the Newswalks. She was joining me from Harare. I'm also happy to have been joined by Blessing Mudavanhu. Blessing Mudavanhu is currently with Culvin University in Poland. Mr. Emmanuel Muzingwani is with the Interactive Diplomatic Desk and is currently based in Namibia. This episode was proudly brought to you by the sponsorship that we got from Global South Opportunities. If you're looking for a scholarship, if you're looking for a job, if you're looking for a research grant, do not forget to hit the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy the day.